In a quiet park bathed in the golden glow of sunset, an aging black veteran steps in to protect a frightened teenager from a power-hungry cop. But his act of courage is met with brutality, a swing of the baton leaving him bloodied and unconscious on the ground. Unable to calm down when finds out father is in the hospital, his son arrives in town and learns the truth. The officer quickly realizes too late that he has made a grave mistake. The late afternoon sun bathed Greenville, Alabama, in a warm golden glow as Nathan Carter stepped out of Millie's diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The streets were quiet, save for the faint hum of passing cars and the distant chatter of children playing in a nearby park. At 65, Nathan moved a little slower than he used to, but his upright posture and firm stride still hinted at the soldier he had once been. Nathan was a man who commanded respect without asking for it. Decades earlier, he'd served in Iraq, earning medals for bravery and leadership. But Greenville knew him not as a war hero but as a mentor, a storyteller, and the man who fixed kids' bikes when their chains slipped off. Today he carried a canvas grocery bag filled with fresh produce, the weight of it light compared to the memories he carried from war and life. As he crossed through the park, Nathan's gaze fell on a scene that immediately put him on alert. Near a rusted old bench, a tall white police officer, Roy Daniels, was towering over a young black teenager. The boy, barely 17, had his back against the bench, his shoulders tense, and his hands held up defensively. Nathan's gut churned. He'd seen scenes like this before too many times. Roy Daniels was well known in town. At 45, he'd been with the Greenville Police Department for over 15 years, and in that time, he'd built a reputation. Some called him old school, but Nathan knew better. Roy was a bully with a badge. He harassed those who couldn't fight back, and knew exactly how to skirt the line between intimidation and legality. Nathan's steps quickened. "Hey," Nathan called out, his voice steady but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Roy turned, and the second he laid eyes on Nathan, his lips curled into a sneer. "This isn't your concern, old man," Roy shot back. His voice carried the kind of arrogance that came with years of unchecked authority. Nathan didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders and closed the distance between them. The boy, eyes wide with fear, looked at Nathan like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "It is my concern when I see someone being harassed," Nathan said evenly. "Let the boy go. He's not hurting anyone." Roy's face darkened. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." He jabbed a finger toward Nathan. "Back off before you get yourself into trouble." Nathan's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice calm. "I've seen trouble before, son. You think you scare me?" The crowd that had begun to gather murmured, their phones already recording. Nathan didn't know it yet, but his words were being captured in shaky frames that would later ignite a firestorm across social media. Roy stepped closer, his hand resting on the handle of his baton. "You're interfering with police business," he growled. "And you're abusing your authority," Nathan countered. "Let the boy go, or I'll make sure your boss hears about this." It happened faster than Nathan expected. Roy shoved Nathan hard in the chest, forcing him to stumble back. But before Nathan could react, Roy swung his baton. It cracked against Nathan's side, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his ribs. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed. Nathan staggered but didn't fall. Years of discipline kept him steady. He raised his hands, showing no aggression, but Roy's face was red with anger now. He swung again, this time higher. The baton struck Nathan across the head and everything blurred. Nathan hit the ground hard. His vision dimmed as blood trickled down his temple. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the teenager running away, tears streaming down his face. The park erupted into chaos. Bystanders yelled, and someone shouted for an ambulance. Phones captured every moment, the blood on the pavement, the look of shock on Roy's face as he realized what he had done, and the panic in his voice as he called for backup, trying to spin the story before it could spiral out of control. Jerome Carter stood at the head of a long conference table, his presence commanding the room. At 42, Jerome was one of the most influential legal figures in Alabama, serving as the state's attorney general. His reputation was built on integrity, unrelenting determination, and a deep belief in justice. The walls of his office were lined with awards, photographs of him shaking hands with governors and activists, and newspaper clippings highlighting his biggest wins. But Jerome didn't let those define him. For him, justice wasn't about headlines, it was about the people who couldn't fight for themselves. Reform doesn't happen overnight, Jerome said to the group of policymakers seated around the table, but it has to start somewhere. And I'll be damned if we let this opportunity slip through our fingers. The room erupted into applause, but Jerome's assistant, Sarah, slipped in through the side door, her face pale. Jerome's eyes met hers immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lowering. "You need to take this," Sarah whispered, holding out his phone. "It's about your father." Jerome's heart dropped. He stepped out of the room, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "This is Jerome Carter." The voice on the other end was shaky. "Mr. Carter, this is Nurse Kelly from Greenville Memorial Hospital. Your father, Nathan Carter, was admitted about half an hour ago. He suffered severe head trauma. He's unconscious, and we need you here immediately." The words hit Jerome like a punch to the gut. He gripped the wall to steady himself, his mind racing. "I'll be there," he said, his voice tight but firm. He hung up and turned to Sarah, his face unreadable. "Clear my schedule. Get the car ready. I need to leave now." Within minutes, Jerome was in the back seat of his black SUV, his mind a storm of questions and anger. How could this have happened? His father, his hero, was lying in a hospital bed, and he had no idea why. He didn't know what awaited him in Greenville, but he knew one thing for certain: someone was going to pay. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in Jerome Carter's ears as he strode down the narrow hospital corridor. The smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, but Jerome barely noticed it. His polished shoes clicked against the tile floor, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet space. Nurses and doctors moved quickly past him, their hurried footsteps matching the chaotic rhythm of his own pounding heart. He hadn't stopped moving since he arrived in Greenville. The moment he stepped out of the SUV and into the hospital, his focus narrowed to one thing: his father. Nathan Carter. The image of his father, the strongest man Jerome had ever known, lying battered and motionless in a hospital bed, was something Jerome wasn't ready to face. But it was real. A nurse guided him to room 214. "He's stable for now," she said softly, her eyes filled with sympathy. "But the trauma to his head caused significant swelling. We've managed to stabilize his vitals, but he's unresponsive." Jerome nodded stiffly. Words felt pointless. When he stepped inside, the sight of Nathan stopped him cold. His father lay pale against the white sheets, an oxygen mask strapped over his nose and mouth, gauze wrapped around his head, stained faintly red despite the nurse's best efforts to clean the wound. IV tubes snaked out from his arms, pumping fluids and medications into his veins. Jerome swallowed hard, forcing himself to step closer. "Dad." He pulled up a chair, his hands shaking as he reached out to grip Nathan's calloused fingers. They felt cold. Too cold. "You're gonna get through this," Jerome whispered, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You hear me? You're gonna get through this." But there was no response. No flicker of movement. No reassuring squeeze of his hand. The rage simmered beneath Jerome's composure, but he shoved it down. Now wasn't the time. Now was the time for answers. Jerome left the hospital an hour later, his jaw tight, his mind already working through strategies. He called his chief investigator, Amelia Grant, as he stepped into the SUV. "Amelia, I need everything on Roy Daniels," he said, his voice sharp. "Personnel files, complaints, anything and everything you can dig up. I want it on my desk within the hour." "Already on it," Amelia replied. "Jerome, I need to tell you, this isn't the first time his name has come up. Daniels has a pattern. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling, but none of it ever stuck. The local department always brushed it under the rug." Jerome's grip on the phone tightened. "Well, it's going to stick this time," he said through clenched teeth. "And I want Martin Hayes, the police chief's Uzi records too. If he's been covering for Daniels, we're taking them both down." "Yes, sir." Jerome hung up and turned to his driver. "Get me to City Hall." Jerome didn't bother announcing his arrival. The front doors of the Greenville Police Department slammed open as he strode inside. Officers turned to stare, and a ripple of recognition spread through the room. "Attorney General Carter," one officer stammered. "What brings you?" "Where's Chief Hayes?" Jerome cut in. The officer hesitated. In his office, sir." Jerome marched past him, his footsteps heavy with purpose. When he reached Hayes' office, he didn't knock. He pushed the door open, finding the chief sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers and an untouched cup of coffee. "Carter," Hayes said, his voice guarded. "I wasn't expecting." "Save it." Jerome's tone was cold and commanding. "You know why I'm here." Hayes leaned back in his chair, trying to appear unfazed, but Jerome caught the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "What happened to my father?" Jerome demanded. Hayes hesitated. "It's an ongoing investigation, and—" Jerome slammed his hand down on the desk, making Hayes flinch. "Don't feed me that bureaucratic garbage. Roy Daniels put my father in a hospital bed, and I want to know why he's still walking free." The chief straightened, trying to recover his composure. "There's protocol, Carter. Daniels claims your father interfered with a lawful arrest. He said your father got physical first." Jerome laughed bitterly. "Physical? My father is 65 years old. Daniels is twice his size and carrying a baton. And you expect me to believe Nathan threw the first punch?" Hayes didn't answer. Jerome leaned in closer. "This ends now, Hayes. I'm opening an independent investigation into this department, and if I find so much as a scrap of evidence that you've been covering for Daniels or anyone else, I'll make sure you lose more than your badge. Do you understand me?" Hayes' jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Good," Jerome said, turning to leave. "And tell Daniels I'm coming for him." Outside the police station, a crowd had already gathered. Protesters lined the street, holding signs that read "Justice for Nathan Carter" and "Stop Police Brutality." Chants of "No justice, no peace" filled the air. Jerome stepped outside, and the crowd immediately turned toward him. Cameras and microphones were shoved in his face. "Mr. Carter, what's the latest on your father's condition? What do you plan to do about Roy Daniels? Are you declaring war on the Greenville Police Department?" Jerome raised a hand, silencing the questions. "My father, Nathan Carter, remains in critical condition after a brutal and unjustified assault by Officer Roy Daniels," Jerome said, his voice steady but filled with restrained anger. "I will not rest until justice is served not just for him but for every victim of police misconduct in this town." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. "This isn't just about one officer," Jerome continued. "This is about a system that has allowed abuse to go unchecked for too long. That ends now." Jerome turned away from the cameras, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on a young black man, one he didn't recognize. But he saw the fear and anger in the young man's eyes, and it reminded him of why this fight mattered. He wasn't just fighting for his father, he was fighting for all of them. Jerome Carter stood at the head of the long conference table in the Greenville District Attorney's office, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound weight. The walls were lined with legal books and framed certificates, but none of it felt important right now. The air buzzed with urgency as his team of investigators and legal aides shuffled through stacks of files, flipping pages and typing furiously on their laptops. Jerome's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I want everything ready by tomorrow morning. I don't care if you have to pull an all-nighter. Every piece of evidence, every record, every single detail about Roy Daniels and Chief Hayes needs to be airtight before we take this to court." Amelia Grant, his chief investigator, looked up from her laptop. Her sharp eyes reflected the same fire burning inside Jerome. "We've already uncovered a disturbing pattern," she said, sliding a folder across the table. 10 formal complaints against Daniels over the past 7 years: excessive force, racial profiling, and unlawful detentions. 5 of those were flagged as closed without further review. Jerome opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. The faces of the victims stared back at him, young black men and women, their statements filled with fear, frustration, and anger. "How many of these were buried?" Jerome asked, his voice tight. "Too many," Amelia replied. "And it gets worse. Daniels was promoted twice during that time, both times after incidents where his actions were questioned but never investigated." Jerome clenched his jaw, and Hayes signed off on every promotion. Amelia nodded. The chief's fingerprints are all over this. We're dealing with a systemic cover-up. Daniels wasn't just protected, he was rewarded. Jerome slammed the folder shut, his frustration boiling over. This ends now, he said firmly. No more delays, no more excuses. Daniels is going to face justice, and so is anyone who protected him. The next morning, Jerome's team filed the official charges against Roy Daniels: aggravated assault, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. The charges sent shockwaves through the small town of Greenville. News outlets picked up the story immediately, and the town was suddenly at the center of a national debate about police brutality and corruption. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, and the protests outside the police station doubled in size. But the backlash came just as quickly. Jerome's phone buzzed with anonymous threats. Angry letters flooded his office, calling him a traitor and accusing him of trying to destroy the police force. Late that evening, Jerome sat alone in his office, staring out at the lights of the city. The weight of the fight ahead felt heavier than ever. The knock on the door broke his thoughts. Amelia stepped inside, her expression grave. "You need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. It was a video, grainy footage from a body cam that had been leaked online. It showed the aftermath of Nathan Carter's assault. Roy Daniels stood over Nathan's unconscious body, barking orders at bystanders to stay back while paramedics tried to stabilize him. But it was what Daniels said that caught Jerome's attention. "This is what happens when you people don't know your place," Daniels sneered in the video. "Maybe this'll teach him a lesson." Jerome's stomach churned as he replayed the clip. He knew it was damning evidence, proof not just of Daniels' actions, but of his intent. "Leak this to the press," Jerome said quietly. Amelia hesitated. "Are you sure? This will fan the flames even more." "Good," Jerome snapped. "Let it burn." The next morning, Jerome returned to the Greenville Police Department, this time flanked by federal investigators and agents from the state attorney's office. The air inside the station was thick with tension as officers exchanged nervous glances. Hayes was waiting for him in his office, his face pale and lined with sweat. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here like this," Hayes growled. "And you've got a lot of blood on your hands," Jerome shot back, his voice cold and cutting. "Daniels is done, and if you think you're walking away from this clean, you're dead wrong." Hayes rose from his chair, but Jerome didn't back down. "You covered for him. You buried complaints, lied to victims, and let him terrorize this community for years. And now the truth is coming out," Jerome continued. "So you have two options: you can resign and cooperate with my investigation, or I'll make sure you leave this department in handcuffs." Hayes' eyes darted to the door, as if looking for an escape. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "The department is bigger than me. Daniels wasn't the only one. There are others. If I fall, so do they." Jerome's expression hardened. "Then let them fall." Hayes sank back into his chair, defeated. "I want your resignation on my desk by the end of the day," Jerome said, turning to leave. "And I want every file in this building open for review. No more secrets." Outside the police station, the protests swelled as news of Hayes' resignation spread. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Jerome knew the fight was far from over. Standing on the courthouse steps, he faced the cameras once again. "Today is just the beginning," he said. "We've exposed corruption and held individuals accountable, but now it's time to rebuild. This department will not operate under a culture of fear and intimidation any longer." Reporters shouted questions, but Jerome's focus was on the crowd, the people who had stood outside the station day and night, demanding justice. "This isn't just about my father," Jerome said, his voice rising. "This is about every person who has ever been silenced, every person who has been told they don't matter. That ends today." The crowd roared, their voices echoing across the square. Jerome stepped back, his heart pounding. He knew the battle ahead would be long, but as he looked out at the faces in the crowd, young and old, black and white, he felt something he hadn't in days. Hope. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras poised to capture every movement, every flicker of emotion. Protesters outside the courthouse chanted for justice, their voices echoing through the marble hallways. Inside, Jerome Carter sat at the prosecutor's table, his jaw set, his eyes sharp and focused. He wasn't just a son seeking justice for his father, he was the Attorney General of Alabama, and today he was delivering a case that would define his career. Roy Daniels sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. The once proud officer now looked smaller, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously across the room. Beside him, his lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Daniels barely seemed to register it. The weight of the charges against him, aggravated assault, abuse of power, and civil rights violations, hung heavy in the air. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair and glasses perched low on her nose, called the court to order. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady, "you may begin." Jerome stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "this case is not just about one man's actions, it's about a system that has failed. A system that allowed Officer Roy Daniels to operate with impunity for years, protected by a culture of silence and corruption." He turned to the jury, letting his words settle. "My father, Nathan Carter, is not just a victim in this case. He is a symbol, a man who served his country, defended its freedoms, and believed in the promise of justice. And yet, when he stepped in to protect a young man from racial harassment, he was brutally attacked by the very institution meant to protect him." Jerome walked toward the defense table, gesturing toward Daniels. The defendant, Roy Daniels, abused his badge, his power, and his authority. He didn't see Nathan Carter as a citizen deserving respect, he saw him as an obstacle to be silenced. Jerome paused, turning back to the jury. "But today, we have the power to send a message. Not just to Roy Daniels, but to every officer who thinks they're above the law, and to every department that turns a blind eye to injustice. Today, we demand accountability." Over the next several hours, Jerome and his team laid out the evidence piece by piece. The first witness, a teenage boy named Marcus, took the stand. His voice trembled at first, but Jerome's steady questioning helped him find confidence. "I was just sitting there," Marcus said. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. But Officer Daniels came up and started asking me questions, where I was going, what I was doing, if I had drugs. I told him no, but he wouldn't leave me alone." "And then what happened?" Jerome asked. Marcus swallowed hard. "That's when Mr. Carter came over. He told the officer I wasn't doing anything wrong. He tried to calm things down." "And what did Officer Daniels do?" "He shoved Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "He just hit him hard. And then he wouldn't stop." Jerome let the silence linger, letting the jury absorb the weight of Marcus's words. The next witness was the paramedic who treated Nathan at the scene. "We found Mr. Carter unconscious with severe head trauma," she said. "We had to stabilize him immediately. If we hadn't gotten there when we did, he might not have survived." Jerome turned to the jury again. "This wasn't just a scuffle," he said. "It was a brutal attack that left an innocent man fighting for his life." The defense tried to spin the narrative. Daniel's lawyer claimed that Nathan Carter had been aggressive, that he had interfered with police work, and that Daniels was acting in self-defense. But Jerome was ready. He presented bodycam footage that contradicted Daniels' statements, showing Nathan standing calmly with his hands raised before Daniels struck him. He revealed internal police records, proving Daniels had a long history of excessive force complaints that were ignored. And he called former officers to the stand, officers who had left the department in disgust at its culture of corruption. One of them, a retired sergeant, testified Roy Daniels was protected. Complaints were buried, witnesses were threatened, and officers who spoke out were pushed out. The jury listened intently, their faces darkening as the evidence piled up. After days of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the room fell silent. The foreman stood and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Roy Daniels, guilty on all charges." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Jerome closed his eyes, exhaling deeply as relief washed over him. Daniels slumped in his chair, his head hanging low. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers. Protesters hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Signs that read justice for Nathan Carter waved in the air. Jerome stepped outside to address the press, his voice strong despite the exhaustion he felt. "This verdict is not the end," he said. "It's the beginning of a long road to reform. We will continue to fight not just for my father, but for every person who has been denied justice. Change is coming." The fallout from the trial was immediate. Martin Hayes, the police chief, resigned in disgrace and was later charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Several other officers were suspended or fired as investigations expanded. Jerome pushed forward with reforms, creating independent oversight committees to monitor police conduct and implementing mandatory training programs on racial sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. And Nathan Carter? He woke up. His recovery was slow, but he faced it with the same determination that had defined his life. At a press conference weeks later, he stood beside his son, a cane in one hand and a microphone in the other. "I'm standing here today," Nathan said, his voice steady, "because my son refused to give up, because this community refused to stay silent. We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure it never happens again." The crowd erupted into applause. Jerome smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a battle and they weren't done yet. The sun rose slowly over Greenville, Alabama, casting a golden hue across the courthouse steps. The town square, once the site of protests and outrage, now held an air of reflection and renewal. Banners calling for justice had been replaced with signs of unity, messages of hope and determination. It had been months since the trial of Roy Daniels ended in a guilty verdict, but the fight for reform was far from over. Jerome Carter stood at the podium in front of a crowd that had gathered for the unveiling of a memorial dedicated to victims of police violence. At his side was Nathan Carter, leaning lightly on his cane but standing tall, his presence a symbol of survival and resilience. The crowd hushed as Jerome stepped forward, his sharp suit pressed and his expression resolute. "Good morning," Jerome began, his voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of the journey they had all taken together. "Today is not just about remembrance, it's about recognition. Recognition of the pain this community has endured, the battles we have fought, and the hope we have built from the ashes of injustice." He looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces, the young man his father had defended that day in the park. Marcus, now volunteering for community outreach programs. Lisa, the barista who had live-streamed the incident, standing with a camera in hand, ready to capture another historic moment. Even Charlie Reed, a former officer who had testified against Roy Daniels and now worked as a youth mentor, stood near the front, his eyes filled with purpose. "This monument," Jerome continued, gesturing to the sleek black stone behind him, etched with the names of those whose lives had been affected by police violence, "is not just a tribute to those we lost. It's a reminder that change is possible, but only if we fight for it together." The crowd applauded, but Jerome raised his hand, signaling that he wasn't finished. "In the wake of my father's attack, we uncovered truths that were painful but necessary," Jerome said. "We exposed corruption that had festered in this town for decades. We faced opposition, threats, and attempts to silence us, but we didn't back down." His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on the new police chief, Erica Miles, an African-American woman and a reform advocate whom Jerome had personally recommended for the position. She nodded firmly, a reminder of the change already taking root. "Today, Greenville has a new police department, one built on accountability, transparency, and service," Jerome said. "With independent oversight committees, body camera mandates, and mandatory de-escalation training, we've created a framework that ensures no officer, no official is above the law." Applause rippled through the crowd as Jerome's words sank in. "But reform doesn't stop here," Jerome added. "We've passed statewide legislation to protect whistleblowers, increase funding for community policing programs, and establish a database to track complaints against officers, ensuring repeat offenders like Roy Daniels can never hide again." The crowd's applause gave way to silence as Nathan Carter stepped up to the microphone. The lines on his face spoke of hardship, but his voice carried the strength of a man who had seen the worst and chosen to keep fighting. "I don't stand here today because I'm strong," Nathan began, his deep voice echoing off the buildings around the square. "I stand here because my son and this community refuse to let injustice have the final word." He paused, glancing at Jerome with pride. "I've served this country," Nathan said, his voice steady. "And I've seen the best and worst of what it can be. But what happened to me, what happens to too many black men in America, should never have been allowed. And yet, it did. I might never forget the pain, but I also won't forget what followed." He gestured toward the crowd. "I saw people come together, black, white, young, old, and demand justice. I saw my son stand in the fire and refuse to let fear or anger break him. And I saw this town decide that it would not let hate define it." Tears welled up in the eyes of many in the crowd as Nathan's words resonated. "I'm proud of Jerome, not just because he's my son, but because he's shown us what courage looks like," Nathan continued. "But this fight doesn't end with him. It belongs to all of us. We have to keep pushing, keep holding each other accountable, and keep believing that change is worth fighting for." The crowd erupted into applause, some standing as tears streamed down their faces. Jerome stepped up and embraced his father, their bond unbroken despite the hardships they had faced. As the ceremony ended, Jerome found himself surrounded by reporters asking questions about his next steps. But it wasn't the cameras that captured his attention, it was the people. A young girl tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I want to be a lawyer like you when I grow up." Jerome knelt down, his smile warm. "You can be anything you want," he said, "and when you're ready, I'll be here to help." The girl beamed and Jerome stood, feeling the weight of responsibility but also the hope of the next generation. Later that evening, Jerome returned to his father's house. Nathan was sitting on the porch, gazing at the sunset. "You did it, son," Nathan said softly as Jerome sat beside him. "We did it," Jerome replied, his voice quiet but resolute. Nathan nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And we'll keep doing it," Nathan said, "because this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Weeks later, Jerome stood in his office at the state capitol, surrounded by boxes of proposals and reports. His fight for justice had turned into a movement, one that was spreading beyond Greenville. Other towns and cities had begun adopting similar reforms, and Jerome had become a national voice for accountability and equity. On his desk sat a framed photograph of Nathan in uniform, smiling proudly, a reminder of why he started this fight and why he would never stop. Jerome picked up his phone as a call came through. "Attorney General Carter," he answered. "We need you in Montgomery," the voice on the other end said. "They're ready to pass the new reform bill." Jerome smiled, grabbing his coat. "I'm on my way." As he stepped out of his office, the camera panned to the courthouse steps, where new banners called for equality and justice, not as distant dreams, but as promises already in motion.